Today we're doing office hours April 18th, 2024. We've got the Pipekit team. We've got Tim, Alan, and Darko. And today we're going to be diving into some discussion on Argo workflow scaling. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then we can take it away. So Tim, I think you were the one that suggested this post to talk about. So I'll let you dive in first.
Yeah, cool. Cheers. I thought it was a bit interesting because it's slightly different to the sort of questions that we often get. To summarize Nathan's problem, he essentially he runs workflows quite sporadically, but when they run, they really run. He was he was talking at some point about up to hundreds of thousands of concurrent workflows, but then other times of days without anything running. So uh, his original question was about scaling the controller down to zero in downtime to try and save some money, basically. He also had some scaling up questions, but that's a fairly common thing that we've probably covered in other office hours, or at least, I mean, I did a talk on it last month, so we probably won't go into that too much. But I thought his use case for scaling down out of hours was quite interesting. Um, the summary of the answer is you can't do that natively. That's not a feature within Argo workflows. It can't scale to zero and then scale itself back up again, because that feels quite difficult. But we did have a bit of a brainstorm session and came up with some ideas of what you could do. I also sort of took it away, and I've actually chatted to Nathan outside of this thread. And actually, once you do the sums, it may not be worth doing any of this. So I'm probably start there. So I think I worked out that at most Nathan's probably spending $100 a month on his workflow controller. And if he does stuff like use spot instances and move to ARM, you're probably saving 50% of that just without really doing anything. So the controller will be quite happy on spot instances. If it dies, as long as you set things up right, it should come back again and it will just carry on where it took off from. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. We run our controllers on ARM. We run everything on ARM here because it just is cheaper. And we have no problems. So I again see no problem with running the controller on ARM. So if you want to just save money without doing any actual work, that's probably the best bang for your buck. And then the harder part is if you really want to scale it down to zero, I think I basically suggested that he looks into Kubernetes informers and writes a small pod that basically looks for the presence of workflows that are not completed. If there are workflows that are not completed in the cluster, then scale the controller up. And then as soon as there aren't any of those workflows left, you can scale the controller down. That was basically the thing I could think of. It would be a relatively small, like Go binary or something like that. And it would be a small pod to run. So it was considerably smaller than a large controller. So you could save your money that way, but I would probably argue at that point you're spending a day coding to save so little money, it may not be worth it. But yeah, that was a brief summary of everything, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of an interesting point to bring up that like if you are just running Argo workflows on Amazon EKS, then because the server and the workflow controller is going to be live at all times, really you are going to just be spending about what, like $100 a month you mentioned, which,
Yeah, I
you
think that
know,
was for, I
isn't
can't
nothing.
remember. It's either 4 or 8 cores for that $100. I can't actually remember. My brain is made of cheese.
Okay.
But yeah, it's
I
not a
think it
lot. I
was an
mean,
8 core.
okay, cheers. And 8 cores is quite a lot for a controller. I mean, he may need bigger and we hadn't actually got to sizing his controller properly for him, but those were the sort of boxes he was talking about. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, if you don't need the API or the UI, then obviously you don't need to run the server at all. So that's something to consider. And many companies don't use the UI or use APIs, so that's relatively common. And there are other ways of scaling up and down in a predictable fashion. You could have a workflow to scale down. Scaling up is a bit harder using workflows. You could just have a cron workflow or something that shuts it down every night, and then you could come in the morning and basically put the replica set back up to one manually in the morning if you had a timed thing. But Nathan's particular issue is that he doesn't know when the work is going to come in. It's kind of comes from customers at random intervals, basically. So
It still does seem just like a lot of work for optimizing like $100 worth of spend though. Like just from
yeah,
a, yeah, like a, I don't know, an IT budget cost benefit basis. Like
I'd agree. I think the only time it really makes sense if it's part of a wider. Alan and I have worked at a previous place where we did basically shut down an entire cluster every night because we had predictable patterns in the work. So the entire cluster, we'd scaled everything down to zero at night and then turn it back on again during working hours. And you basically save half of your cloud costs if you can do that because you're not running at weekends, you're not running at night and stuff like that. But that only works for predictable patterns, and that's easy to do. You just write a script that turns everything to zero, and then maybe re-enables Argo CD or something in the morning to put everything right again.
is that similar to what y'all have done with our like internal cluster? So the cluster that we use for our own like CI and data jobs. I mean, our external cluster obviously needs to be live pretty much at all times, but I know y'all have been working on making the other one cost us less money.
So our internal cluster doesn't quite go down to zero because again, it's that cost benefit thing. So it basically it goes down to almost zero whenever it's not being used, but there's enough running there so that it will scale up as soon as you try and run a CI job or something like that. So it was kind of if we scale to zero, then a human would have to do more work to be able to start running CI, say out of hours or something like that. So then you've got that kind of trade off of, as you say, you're saving what like $3 a night or something like that for the sake of annoying some developer who's desperately trying to fix some sort of P0 issue in the middle of the night. Yeah, it's not really worth it at that point, in my opinion.
Couple of things I was going to add. Firstly, you can obviously run mixed Kubernetes. Not obviously, I'm saying this because it's not obvious. You can run mixed Kubernetes cluster. You can have an ARM workflow controller, which is controlling jobs that are running on x86 or other platforms. So that's worth knowing. And what does come out of this potentially is rather than if you're not adamant that you need to scale all the way to zero, perhaps as an upstream feature, we should support via a tiny operator that counts the number of workflows that are in your cluster, export that via metrics, and then do a vertical pod autoscaler. That would be relatively trivial to implement. Basically, a thing outside the workflows controller, or even the workflows controller itself, could export that metric and then via the metrics. I mean, it does already export that metric. I'm thinking aloud here. So there is a count already exported of the number of workflows in your cluster. You could tie that into a metrics provider in terms of a Kubernetes metrics provider, and then use the vertical pod autoscaler to autoscale your controller upwards and downwards. It can't go horizontally.
Yes, and it can't go to zero.
And it can't go to zero, which I know is the original requirement. But
yes,
you could take your $100 a month down to $15 a month single core, maybe, if you're lucky. Probably a 2-core. So $25 a month. Sorry.
Potentially ignorant question, Alan. So I haven't looked at or played with the vertical pod autoscaler in a long time. Is it still the case that you have to like kill the pod and start a new one every time you or every time it runs a scaling operation? And is that something that would have an effect like on the workflows? We know that like within the context of a workflow itself, vertical pod auto scaling for shooting the pod, like doesn't work, but for the like the server and the controller, how would that play out?
Well, for the server, I'm not including that in this. For the server, you can horizontally scale, and that's the recommended approach for that one. So for the controller, yes, in theory, you could. I mean, the purpose, the controller is supposed to successfully do things when it restarts. So if it restarts, and it will be necessary that it restarts if what you're targeting is running it on a small node and running it on a big node to save costs. If you've got a cluster that's doing other jobs, then it might be that it can scale up and down on the same node. As of Kubernetes 127, 128, there is dynamic scaling for a pod, where those resource limits can change on the fly. I haven't played with it either in that manner, but that should in theory mean, especially scale downs don't need the restart, but then you probably want to skip it off your big node and onto a small node, so that does need a restart. Yeah, but it all should be okay.
Glad to hear that it'll be okay.
He said should.
Yeah,
This
should
is
was the
engineering
keyword on that one.
conversation.
Should is always worrisome whenever I see an engineer saying should, but is what it is. I remember at KubeCon, like pod snapshotting was a thing for restarts. Is that something that could come into play potentially, like whenever the auto scaling happens, like snapshotting the pod to restart it on a smaller node?
Potentially, yes, but it's that was a very beta technology, alpha technology. Whether the controller would be happy with all the conditions that are required for cryo to freeze it and re-instantiate it, which was the underlying technology, is needs testing, I guess. But it'd be fun to play, see whether it works.
All of this to save $75, or what was it? Yeah, 85.
Well, yes, in the context of one person, but in the context of everybody who wants workflows being able to get access to vertical pod auto scaling, if we did it upstream, that's a much bigger number of, we're saving the seals and the puppies across the world by allowing AI to run on more compute instead of workflows.
Yeah, really twisting the seals and the puppies knife that'll get the motivation happening. All right. More threads that we can go down relative to the scaling down the workflow controller. Otherwise, we could dive into something else or wrap it up.
You might want to stop sharing your screen, by the way, because people have probably been staring at a screen rather than us in a video for 10 minutes, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But another of Nathan's issues, but ultimately Nathan's issue was that he had no observability, so he wasn't really aware of what was going on in his cluster. So there was a lot of guesswork about what size the controller should be. So probably worth mentioning that we have a free observability tool, which I'm sure JP will possibly bring up in a second for the URL. So yeah, there's that.
Give me 1 minute.
That's all right. I'll keep talking. So yeah, we discussed the need for observability so that he could right-size stuff anyway. Because as I say, at the moment he was guessing. We're guessing at $100 a month, but maybe he needs less, and maybe he just needs a bit of tuning. Maybe he needs more. We genuinely don't know. The other slightly interesting thing from Nathan's, but from my discussion with Nathan, is that he hadn't set any resource requests on any of his workflow steps. So he had many pods on individual nodes. And again, he had no observability, so we don't know actually if that's bad or good. I suspect it's bad. I suspect those pods were all arguing for CPU that they didn't have allocated to them and all that sort of stuff. So my recommendation to him was, even without observability, just set some sort of request, even if it's like 100 milli CPU or something like that, just to ring fence something for each pod. Yeah. And yeah, he's going to take that way and see how that goes for him. But yeah, it all looked a bit tight on his cluster. If you just bring up the sign up page, JP, I think that's probably all I was really going for. Yeah, I can't think of anything else about Nathan's issue, unless you can, Alan.
No, yeah, you talked to him most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you can sign up for workflow metrics there. Hopefully the URL's not on this screen. It's pipekit.io/metrics dash sign up, I think. There you go. And yeah, we basically just give you some free metrics to understand how workflows is running in your cluster. So an overview of your Kubernetes API, an overview of your workflow controller, and loads of other stuff as well, just to give you that just high level summary of what's going on in your cluster. And as I say, it's completely free. There's no strings or anything like that. So yeah, you can register for that now.
Tim, I think you're going to need to calm down with the enthusiasm on that sales pitch.
Isn't metrics on staging? I'm not sure that points to any real metrics, does it?
Tim, you can check, and if so, I'll give you the screen share access.
No, it's not on staging.
Oh no, the actual UI is not in staging yet. So.
All right. In that case, any other items for us to chat about? Well, I think if I had $1 for every time anyone on the team has mentioned metrics over the past 2-3 months, I think we would be in quite good shape, probably retire. But it has been a great journey, and I'm excited to have this product fully released.
Yeah.
All right, gang. In that case, thanks for joining us for another Pipekit office hours session, and we will see y'all next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.